The flames were visible from 6 blocks away. At 2:47 a.m. on August 8th, 1937, Samuel's hardware store on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue became an inferno. The fire department would later report that the blaze reached temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt the iron window frames and turn the brick facade black with soot. 17 firefighters from Engine Company 58 fought the fire for 3 hours before bringing it under control. By sunrise, Samuel's hardware store was nothing but a smoking shell. The official report listed the cause as arson, accelerant used. What the report didn't say, what it couldn't say, was that 3 witnesses had seen 4 men in a dark sedan pour gasoline around the building's perimeter at 2:30 a.m. What it didn't mention was that those same witnesses saw one of the men toss a burning rag through the front window before the sedan sped away. And what absolutely wasn't included in any official documentation was that 2 of those witnesses recognized the men as known associates of the Ku Klux Klan's New York operations. Samuel Horowitz was 61 years old. He'd owned that hardware store for 23 years, since 1914, when Harlem was still a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. As the demographics shifted and black families moved in during the 1920s and 30s, many of the white business owners left. But Samuel stayed. His customers were now mostly black. His neighborhood had transformed, but his commitment to fair prices and honest dealing never wavered. He sold tools to working men. He extended credit to families going through hard times. He sponsored a little league team and donated supplies to local churches. He wasn't involved in organized crime. He didn't run numbers. He didn't have protection from any mob family. He was just a Jewish shopkeeper trying to make an honest living in a changing neighborhood, which made him the perfect target. The KKK's campaign of intimidation in Harlem during the summer of 1937 was systematic and brutal. They'd learned from their earlier mistakes, particularly from what happened in the Hunts Point warehouse in 1936. They weren't sending anonymous letters anymore. They weren't arranging confrontational meetings. Instead, they were using fire, vandalism, and anonymous terror to drive out business owners who refused to sell their properties at below-market prices. Between June and August 1937, 11 businesses in Harlem had been vandalized or burned. The police investigations went nowhere. Witnesses were too terrified to speak. Insurance companies paid out minimal claims, citing policy exclusions for civil disturbances. And the property owners, faced with destroyed businesses and no hope of justice, sold their buildings for pennies on the dollar. Samuel's hardware store was number 12. But this time, something was different. Because when Bumpy Johnson arrived at the smoldering ruins at 6:15 a.m. on August 8th, accompanied by his associate Junie Bird and a young attorney named Theodore Wilson, he didn't look angry. He didn't rage at the injustice. He didn't make threats or promises. He smiled. It was a small smile, brief, almost private, but several witnesses noted it. Detective Sergeant William McCarthy, who was overseeing the arson investigation, saw it and later described it in his case notes as unsettling. A newspaper photographer from the Amsterdam News captured it in a photo that was never published. And Samuel Horowitz himself, standing in front of his destroyed livelihood with tears streaming down his face, saw that smile and felt something he couldn't quite explain. Not hope exactly, but perhaps the absence of hopelessness. "Mr. Horowitz," Bumpy said quietly, "I'm sorry about your store." Samuel nodded, unable to speak. "I want you to know something," Bumpy continued. "You won't be rebuilding alone. And the people who did this, they're going to wish they'd chosen a different target." Bumpy stayed at the scene for exactly 11 minutes. He walked the perimeter of the burned building. He spoke briefly with McCarthy. He took several photographs with a small camera he carried. And then he left, still wearing that small, knowing smile. 72 hours later, the smile would make perfect sense. 72 hours later, 6 men would have left New York City permanently. 72 hours later, the KKK's operations in Harlem would effectively cease to exist. And 72 hours later, nobody, not the perpetrators, not the police, not the newspapers, not even most of Harlem's residents, would be willing to speak about what happened. Because what Bumpy Johnson did in those 72 hours wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It wasn't even technically illegal in ways that could be prosecuted. But it was so comprehensive, so devastating, and so perfectly executed that it became the kind of operation that people only discussed in whispers, if they discussed it at all. This is the story of those 72 hours. The story of how one burned hardware store became the catalyst for the complete dismantling of the KKK's presence in Harlem. The story of how Bumpy Johnson turned a moment of terrorism into a masterclass in strategic destruction. And it started with that smile at 6:15 a.m. on August 8th, 1937. Because Bumpy Johnson already knew something that the arsonists didn't. He knew exactly who they were. He knew where they lived. He knew who they worked for. And most importantly, he knew their weaknesses. He'd known for weeks. And he'd been waiting for them to make exactly this kind of mistake. To understand why Bumpy smiled at the ruins of Samuel's hardware store, you need to understand what had been happening in Harlem throughout the summer of 1937. The fire on August 8th wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a coordinated campaign that had been escalating for months. The KKK's northern strategy in 1937 was different from their southern operations. In the South, they could operate relatively openly, protected by sympathetic local governments and law enforcement. But in New York City, they had to be more subtle. They couldn't hold public rallies or burn crosses in the street. Instead, they worked through front organizations, corrupt officials, and terror tactics designed to look random. The architect of this northern strategy was a man named Walter Kincaid. Unlike Eugene Whitmore, who'd been humiliated in the warehouse incident of 1936, Kincaid was educated, strategic, and remarkably patient. He was 51 years old in 1937, a former insurance adjuster who joined the KKK in 1923 during its peak membership period. He'd risen through the ranks, not through violence, but through organizational skill and strategic thinking. Kincaid understood something that many Klan members didn't. In northern cities, economic power was more effective than physical intimidation. If you could force Black and Jewish business owners to sell their properties at distressed prices, you could reshape neighborhoods without ever burning a single cross. The key was to create enough fear and economic pressure that selling seemed like the only rational choice. Between 1935 and 1937, Kincaid had built a sophisticated network. He had relationships with crooked insurance adjusters who would deny claims. He had connections to arson-for-hire specialists who could make fires look accidental. He had corrupt building inspectors who would find violations in targeted properties. And he had real estate companies ready to buy distressed properties at below-market rates. The campaign that led to Samuel's hardware store being burned had actually started in June 1937 with a series of seemingly unrelated incidents. A tailor shop on 135th Street had its windows smashed. A bakery on Lenox Avenue failed a surprise health inspection and was shut down for 2 weeks. A small grocery store on 127th Street had a suspicious fire in its storage room. A barber shop on 126th Street was robbed 3 times in 1 month. Each incident, viewed in isolation, could be dismissed as random urban crime. But viewed together, a pattern emerged. All the targeted businesses were owned by either Black or Jewish proprietors. All were located in areas where property values were rising, and all received purchase offers within days of the incidents. By August 1937, 11 businesses had been hit. 8 had sold their properties and left Harlem. 3 were holding out, including Samuel Horowitz. What Kincaid didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Bumpy Johnson had been tracking this pattern since early July. Bumpy's intelligence network in Harlem was legendary. He had informants everywhere, street vendors who noticed unusual vehicles, taxi drivers who overheard conversations, cleaning ladies who worked in office buildings, waiters who served late-night meetings. Nothing significant happened in Harlem without Bumpy knowing about it within 24 hours. By mid-July, Bumpy had identified the pattern of attacks. By late July, he had connected several of the incidents to known KKK associates. And by early August, he had identified Walter Kincaid as the probable architect of the campaign. But Bumpy didn't move immediately. That wasn't his style. Instead, he did what he always did. He gathered information, mapped out connections, identified weaknesses, and waited for the right moment. According to later testimony from Theodore Wilson, the young attorney who worked with Bumpy on various legal matters, Bumpy had called a meeting on August 1st with his core team. Junie Bird, Illinois Gordon, and a man known as Ace who handled Bumpy's financial operations. The meeting took place in a private room at Small's Paradise, a famous Harlem nightclub. They're going to escalate, Bumpy had said, according to Wilson's account. They've hit 11 businesses and only got 8 to sell. The 3 that are holding out make them look weak. So they're going to do something dramatic. Something that creates enough fear that the others fall in line. How do you know? Junie had asked. Because that's what I would do if I were them. And we need to be ready when it happens. Bumpy had then outlined a plan. A comprehensive, multi-layered response that would only be triggered when the KKK made their next move. He assigned specific tasks to each person. He established communication protocols. And he made one thing absolutely clear. When the KKK escalated, Bumpy's response would be so overwhelming that they'd never attempt anything in Harlem again. Samuel's hardware store burned 1 week later, and Bumpy's 72-hour response plan activated immediately. At 7:30 a.m. on August 8th, 95 minutes after Bumpy left the scene of the fire, a meeting took place in the back room of a diner on 145th Street. Present were Bumpy Johnson, Theodore Wilson, and a man named Robert Morrison who worked as a clerk in the New York City Department of Buildings. Morrison was nervous. He'd been providing information to Bumpy for 6 months, details about building inspections, property transfers, code violations. It was low-level stuff, the kind of information that seemed harmless in isolation but became valuable when combined with other intelligence. Morrison did it for the money. Bumpy paid him $50 a month, which was half Morrison's legitimate salary. I need everything you have on property transfers in Harlem over the past 6 months, Bumpy said. Specifically, any properties that sold for significantly below market value following incidents or violations. Morrison nodded. I can get that, but it'll take time to... You have 3 hours, Bumpy interrupted, and I need the names of every inspector, every adjuster, and every company involved in those transactions. Morrison left 20 minutes later, pale but determined. The next meeting was at 9:15 a.m., this time with Detective Sergeant William McCarthy at a coffee shop in Midtown Manhattan, neutral territory away from Harlem and away from McCarthy's precinct. McCarthy and Bumpy had a complicated relationship. McCarthy was one of the few honest cops in a department riddled with corruption. He genuinely cared about keeping Harlem safe, but he was also pragmatic enough to recognize that Bumpy's illegal numbers operation actually created stability in the neighborhood. They'd worked together, informally, on several occasions when their interests aligned. The arson at Samuel's, McCarthy said. You know something? It wasn't a question. I know several things, Bumpy replied. I know it's part of a pattern. I know the pattern is connected to KKK operations. And I know that if you don't solve this case, there are going to be more fires. McCarthy sighed. I can't touch the KKK without evidence. And even with evidence, half the department would block any serious investigation. What if I gave you evidence? Not just for the fire at Samuel's, but for all 11 prior incidents? Names, dates, connections to specific arson-for-hire operators. McCarthy was quiet for a long moment. You'd be implicating yourself in some of this information gathering. Would I? Or would I just be a concerned citizen passing along information I'd heard through community sources? And what do you want in return? Bumpy smiled. Not the small smile from earlier, but something colder. I want you to be slow. When things start happening over the next few days, I want you to take your time investigating. File your reports properly, but don't rush. Can you do that? McCarthy understood exactly what Bumpy was asking. 48 hours. After that, I have to do my job. 48 hours is plenty. They shook hands. At 11 a.m., Bumpy met with Marcus Lee, the same Marcus who'd been Helen Lawrence's cousin and who'd grown into one of Bumpy's most trusted operatives. Marcus now ran a small photography business, legitimate work that also gave him the perfect cover for surveillance operations. I need you to photograph 4 locations, Bumpy said, handing Marcus a list of addresses. Exterior shots. Document who comes and goes. I need to know their routines. The addresses were homes and businesses belonging to men Bumpy had identified as being involved in the arson campaign. Marcus would spend the next 18 hours documenting their movements, creating a detailed picture of their habits and vulnerabilities. At 1:30 p.m., Robert Morrison returned with the property records. The data confirmed what Bumpy had suspected, a pattern of coordinated property acquisitions following incidents that created distressed sales. The same 3 real estate companies kept appearing as buyers. The same insurance adjusters kept denying claims. The same building inspectors kept finding violations. Bumpy spent 2 hours with Theodore Wilson, the attorney, going through the records and building a comprehensive map of the operation. They identified 19 people who were definitively involved in the scheme, from the arsonists who set the fires to the real estate agents who facilitated the sales. By 4 p.m., Bumpy had what he needed, a complete picture of Walter Kincaid's operation, including names, addresses, financial connections, and most importantly, vulnerabilities. At 6 p.m., Bumpy called another meeting, this time with a larger group. In addition to his core team, he brought in representatives from Harlem's various power structures. Reverend Charles Williams from Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of Harlem's most influential black churches. Solomon Bernstein, a Jewish community leader who ran a charitable organization. And Catherine Davis, who operated a network of domestic workers and had intelligence connections throughout the city. Bumpy explained the situation clearly. The KKK has been running a systematic campaign to force property sales in Harlem. Samuel's hardware store was their latest target. But this isn't just about Samuel. It's about whether Harlem can be intimidated into submission. Reverend Williams spoke first. What do you need from us? I need the community to stay calm for the next 3 days. No protests, no confrontations, no public outcry. Just quiet. Can you do that? The community leaders exchanged glances. It was an unusual request. Usually, they'd be organizing marches and demanding justice. Why quiet? Catherine Davis asked. Because what I'm about to do works better in silence. And when it's done, the problem will be solved. Permanently. But I need the community to trust me and stay out of the way. After some discussion, they agreed. The community would remain calm. No public demonstrations. No inflammatory speeches. Just patient waiting. By midnight on August 8th, 21 hours after the fire, Bumpy had assembled everything he needed. Detailed intelligence, documented evidence, cooperation from law enforcement, and community agreement to remain quiet while he worked. The 72-hour countdown had truly begun, and the KKK had no idea what was coming. The second 24 hours began with a phone call. At 2:15 a.m. on August 9th, Walter Kincaid was awakened in his home in Queens by his telephone ringing. This wasn't unusual. Kincaid often received late-night calls related to his various operations. But this call was different. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and completely unfamiliar. Mr. Kincaid, I'm calling to inform you that your operations in Harlem have been compromised. You have 48 hours to dissolve your organization and leave New York City. This is not a negotiation. Kincaid, still half asleep, was confused and angry. Who is this? Someone who knows that you ordered the arson at Samuel's hardware store. Someone who knows about your real estate scheme. Someone who has documented every property transfer, every denied insurance claim, and every connection between your organization and the 11 incidents since June. You're bluffing. Am I? Let me tell you something you think nobody knows. On July 23rd, you met with Thomas Riley, an arson specialist, at a restaurant in Brooklyn. You paid him $500 to burn Samuel's hardware store. You specifically told him to make it look random. The meeting was witnessed and documented. Shall I continue? Kincaid was now fully awake and deeply concerned. The meeting with Riley had been conducted with extreme caution. They'd met in a location far from Harlem, late at night, with no witnesses, or so Kincaid had thought. What do you want? I told you. Dissolve your operation. Leave New York. You have 48 hours. The line went dead. Kincaid immediately called an emergency meeting of his core team for later that morning. But by the time they gathered at 9 a.m. on August 9th, the situation had already deteriorated significantly. Thomas Riley, the arsonist who'd actually burned Samuel's hardware store, had been arrested at 6:30 a.m. by federal agents. Not local police, but FBI agents investigating interstate arson-for-hire operations. According to the arrest report, agents had received an anonymous tip including detailed information about Riley's involvement in multiple arsons across New York and New Jersey. At 8:15 a.m., David Chambers, one of the insurance adjusters who'd been denying claims for targeted properties, received a visit at his office from two men claiming to be from the New York State Insurance Commission. They had questions about suspicious patterns in his claim denials. They also had documentation suggesting he'd been receiving kickbacks from real estate companies. The investigation would eventually lead to Chambers being fired and facing criminal charges. At 8:45 a.m., Harold Benson, a building inspector who'd been writing fraudulent violation notices, arrived at work to find that his supervisor wanted to discuss irregularities in his inspection reports. Specifically, reports where properties had been cited for violations that mysteriously disappeared after the properties were sold. Benson would be suspended by the end of the day. And at 9:30 a.m., 30 minutes after Kincaid's emergency meeting began, one of his key associates, a real estate agent named Martin Cross, called to say he'd received photographs in the mail. Photographs showing a meeting with known Klan members. Photographs that, if made public, would destroy his legitimate business and possibly result in criminal charges. Kincaid's organization was being systematically dismantled and had only been 31 hours since the fire. But Bumpy wasn't done. If you're finding value in this deep dive into real history, hit that subscribe button. This is the kind of story that doesn't get told in textbooks, the kind that shows how power actually works when traditional authority structures fail. Now let's get back to August 9th, 1937, because the real devastation was just beginning. At 2 p.m. on August 9th, Walter Kincaid received a package at his home. Inside was a folder containing copies of financial records showing payments from Kincaid to various individuals involved in the arson and intimidation campaign. The records were accurate, detailed, and absolutely damning. Attached was a note. 36 hours remaining. At 4:30 p.m., two of the men who'd actually poured gasoline around Samuel's hardware store and set it ablaze received visits from different people with similar messages. One was visited by a representative from the Italian mob family that controlled his neighborhood in Brooklyn. The representative explained that they'd received information about his activities and that his presence in Brooklyn was no longer welcome. He had 24 hours to relocate. The other arsonist received a visit from two federal agents investigating KKK activities. They had questions about his whereabouts on the night of August 7th. They also had a witness who'd seen him near 125th Street at 2:30 a.m. on August 8th. Both men were on buses out of New York City by midnight. At 6 p.m., the real estate company that had purchased 8 of the 11 distressed properties received notification that they were being audited by the Internal Revenue Service. The audit would focus specifically on property acquisitions made between June and August 1937. The company's accountant, upon reviewing the notification, immediately recognized that someone had provided extremely detailed information to the IRS. Information that could only have come from someone with inside access to the transactions. By midnight on August 9th, 45 hours after the fire, Kincaid's organization had lost its arson specialist to federal arrest, its insurance adjuster to state investigation, its building inspector to departmental suspension, its real estate front company to IRS audit, and 2 of its actual arsonists to forced relocation. And through all of this, there had been no violence, no confrontations, no dramatic showdowns, just information strategically deployed to the right people at the right time. This was Bumpy Johnson's genius. He understood that in 1937 America, a black man couldn't directly confront white supremacist organizations through official channels. The system was too corrupt, too biased. But he could feed information to various authorities who had their own motivations for acting. Federal agents who wanted arrests. State regulators who wanted to look effective. Corrupt police who wanted to protect their own operations from competition. Mob families who wanted to maintain territorial boundaries. Bumpy had turned Kincaid's organization into a threat to multiple powerful entities, and then he'd step back and let those entities destroy it. The last 24 hours of Bumpy's 72-hour response began with silence. On the morning of August 10th, Walter Kincaid woke up to realize that his entire organization had effectively collapsed in less than 2 days. His arson specialist was in federal custody. His insurance adjuster was under investigation. His building inspector was suspended. His real estate front company was being audited, and several of his key operatives had fled the city. But more importantly, he realized something else. Whoever had orchestrated this destruction had never made direct contact. There had been one anonymous phone call, anonymous tips to various authorities, anonymous packages with documentation, but no face-to-face confrontation, no demands for money, no opportunity for negotiation. This was what made it so terrifying. Kincaid couldn't identify his enemy to strike back. He couldn't negotiate because there was no one to negotiate with. All he could do was watch his operation disintegrate. At 10 a.m., Kincaid received another phone call. Same voice as before. You have 14 hours remaining. If you're still in New York City at midnight, the evidence packages go to the newspapers. Your name will be on the front page of the Amsterdam News and the New York Times. Your photograph will be published. Your home address will be public, and you'll be identified as the architect of the arson campaign in Harlem. I need more time. 14 hours. The line went dead. Kincaid understood the threat. If his identity and role became public, he wouldn't just face legal consequences. He'd become a target. Every black resident of Harlem who'd been victimized by the campaign would know his name and address. The police, even the corrupt ones, would have to act if the case became high profile. And the KKK itself might disavow him to avoid the negative publicity. He had no choice. By 3 p.m. on August 10th, Walter Kincaid had packed 2 suitcases and purchased a train ticket to Chicago. He would leave that evening, abandoning his home, his operation, and his entire New York life. But before he left, he made one final attempt to understand who had destroyed him. He called an associate who had connections in Harlem's criminal underworld. "I need to know who did this to me," Kincaid said. There was a long pause. Then, "You really don't know?" "Know what?" "Samuel's hardware store. The one you burned. You know whose territory that's in?" "It's Harlem. It's—" And then it hit him. The realization came with the force of a physical blow. Bumpy Johnson. He'd burned a store in Bumpy Johnson's territory. He'd created fear and chaos in a neighborhood that Bumpy protected. And Bumpy had responded not with violence or confrontation, but with systematic, comprehensive destruction of everything Kincaid had built. "Oh God," Kincaid whispered. "Yeah," his associate said. "You didn't know?" Kincaid hung up. He sat in his nearly empty house and understood, with perfect clarity, that he'd made the same mistake Eugene Whitmore had made in 1936. He'd underestimated Bumpy Johnson. He thought Harlem was vulnerable because it was predominantly black. He thought he could operate with impunity because he was white and connected. He'd been wrong. At 7:30 p.m., Walter Kincaid boarded a train to Chicago. He would never return to New York City. His operation, which had successfully forced 8 property sales and seemed unstoppable just 72 hours earlier, was finished. The last domino fell at 9 p.m. when the final 2 members of Kincaid's core team, men who'd been involved in planning the arson campaign but who hadn't yet been directly targeted, received packages at their homes. Each package contained photographs, financial records, and a simple note: "Leave New York by midnight or these go public." Both men left. By midnight on August 10th, exactly 72 hours after Samuel's hardware store burned, every person significantly involved in the KKK's Harlem operation had either been arrested, forced to flee, or placed under investigation. And it had happened so quietly that most of Harlem's residents didn't even know it was occurring. On the morning of August 11th, for days after the fire, Samuel Horowitz returned to his destroyed hardware store. He'd spent the previous 3 days staying with his daughter in Brooklyn, too devastated to face the ruins. But he needed to salvage what he could and begin the painful process of filing insurance claims that probably wouldn't be honored. What he found shocked him. A crew of 6 men were already at the site, clearing debris. A truck was parked nearby, loaded with construction materials. And standing in the midst of it all was Bumpy Johnson, holding what appeared to be architectural plans. "Mr. Horowitz," Bumpy said, walking over. "Good morning." Samuel was confused. What is this?" "This is your new store. We're rebuilding it. Should be done in 6 weeks, maybe 8. I can't afford. It's covered. Consider it a community investment. But the insurance will pay out. I've arranged for a different adjuster to review your claim. You'll get what you're owed. But we're not waiting for insurance companies. The work starts today." Samuel's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing this?" Bumpy was quiet for a moment. "Because what happened to you wasn't just an attack on your store. It was an attack on Harlem, on the idea that people can live and work here safely. And I don't allow those kinds of attacks to go unanswered. The men who did this are gone. They won't be bothering you or anyone else in Harlem. Not now. Not ever." Samuel wanted to ask how Bumpy had managed that, how he'd identified the arsonists, how he'd forced them to leave, how he'd arranged all of this in just 3 days. But something in Bumpy's expression suggested that these questions were better left unasked. "Thank you," Samuel said simply. Bumpy nodded and walked away. The rebuilding of Samuel's hardware store became a community project. The crew that cleared the debris and rebuilt the structure were local workers, paid fair wages. The materials were purchased from suppliers in Harlem, keeping the money in the community. And when the store reopened in late September 1937, it was bigger and better than before, with modern fixtures and expanded inventory. But the real impact of those 72 hours extended far beyond one hardware store. The 11 businesses that had been targeted before Samuel's were contacted by representatives from Bumpy's organization. The 3 that hadn't sold, yet were given the same protection Samuel received: rebuilding assistance, insurance support, and the assurance that they wouldn't be targeted again. The 8 that had already sold were given first right of refusal to buy back their properties at the prices they'd been forced to sell for. 5 took the offer. They returned to Harlem, reopened their businesses, and continued serving the community. The KKK's presence in Harlem, which had been growing steadily since 1935, effectively ended in August 1937. Without Walter Kincaid to coordinate operations, without corrupt officials to facilitate property schemes, and without arsonists willing to risk federal prosecution, the organization simply couldn't function. According to FBI records from a 1938 investigation into KKK activities in northern cities, the organization's New York operations declined by approximately 80% between August 1937 and December 1938. While the records don't specifically mention Bumpy Johnson or the Samuel's hardware incident, The timeline is clear. The KKK's northern expansion stopped abruptly in late summer 1937. The story of what happened in those 72 hours became one of Harlem's best-kept secrets. Most residents knew that Samuel's hardware store had burned and that it had been rebuilt. They knew that several other targeted businesses had received similar support. And they knew that the campaign of intimidation that had terrorized the neighborhood all summer had suddenly stopped. But the specifics, how Bumpy had identified every person involved, how he'd systematically destroyed Kincaid's organization, how he'd used information and strategic pressure rather than violence, those details remained largely hidden. This secrecy was intentional. Bumpy understood that speaking publicly about what he'd done would create problems. It would force law enforcement to investigate him, even if they privately approved of the results. It would make him a target for revenge, and it would undermine the mystique that made his protection effective. Instead, the story circulated in whispers and implications. People knew that Bumpy had done something. They knew it had been effective, but the details remained vague enough that he maintained plausible deniability. Theodore Wilson, the attorney who'd worked closely with Bumpy on the operation, later reflected on this in an interview conducted in the 1960s. Bumpy understood something profound about power. The most effective exercises of power are often the ones that remain invisible. If you destroy your enemies publicly, you create martyrs and invite retaliation. But if you destroy them quietly, strategically, in ways that look like natural consequences of their own actions, they can't fight back because they can't even clearly identify what you did. Detective Sergeant William McCarthy, who'd given Bumpy the 48 hours he needed, wrote about the incident in his unpublished memoir. I knew what Johnson was doing. I knew he was orchestrating something comprehensive. But when I looked at each individual piece, the FBI arrest, the state investigations, the IRS audit, I couldn't find anything that directly implicated him. He'd simply provided information to people who had their own reasons to act. Was that a crime? Technically, no. Was it extraordinary strategic thinking? Absolutely. The smile that Bumpy wore at 6:15 a.m. on August 8th, standing in front of Samuel's burned store, made sense now. He wasn't smiling at the destruction. He was smiling because he already knew how the next 72 hours would unfold. He'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering intelligence, building cases, establishing connections with various authorities. All he needed was for the KKK to give him a reason to activate his plan. When they burned Samuel's hardware store, they gave him that reason, and they sealed their own fate. The broader impact of those 72 hours extended beyond Harlem. Word spread through organized crime networks that Bumpy Johnson had taken down an entire KKK operation without firing a shot. This enhanced his reputation among other criminal organizations and made clear that Harlem was under sophisticated protection. It also demonstrated something important to Harlem's residents. They weren't helpless. Even when official authorities failed them, when police ignored crimes, when insurance companies denied claims, when courts dismissed cases, there were other forms of power that could protect them. This wasn't a perfect solution. Bumpy was still a criminal. His numbers operation was still illegal. The protection he offered came with its own costs and complications. But in a world where legal remedies were often unavailable to Black Americans, his alternative form of justice served a real purpose. Samuel Horowitz operated his hardware store until 1956, when he retired and passed the business to his son. He never publicly discussed what happened in August 1937, but he never forgot it either. According to his granddaughter, interviewed in the 1990s, Samuel kept a photograph of Bumpy Johnson on his office wall for the rest of his life. When asked why, he would simply say, "That man saved my store, and probably my life." Walter Kincaid lived in Chicago until his death in 1963. He never returned to New York. He never attempted to rebuild his organization. And according to sources who knew him in his later years, he never spoke about what happened in August 1937. The comprehensive, systematic destruction of everything he'd built remained too painful to discuss. The other men involved in the operation scattered across the country. Thomas Riley, the arsonist, served 6 years in federal prison. David Chambers, the insurance adjuster, was convicted of fraud and served 3 years. Several others simply disappeared from public records, presumably living quiet lives under different names in different cities. And in Harlem, life continued. The neighborhood faced new challenges, new threats, new struggles. But the lesson of August 1937 remained. Harlem was protected, not by official authorities, not by written laws, but by a network of intelligence, strategy, and power that operated in the shadows and struck with devastating precision when necessary. Bumpy Johnson never publicly took credit for what happened in those 72 hours. He didn't need to. His reputation spoke for itself. And the fact that nobody, not the perpetrators, not the police, not even most of Harlem's residents, could definitively explain exactly what he'd done made it all the more powerful. Because the greatest power isn't the power everyone can see. It's the power that operates silently, strikes precisely, and leaves no fingerprints. The power that turns your enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The power that makes systematic destruction look like natural consequences. The power that protects an entire community while remaining invisible. That was Bumpy Johnson's power. And on August 8th, 1937, when he smiled at the ruins of Samuel's hardware store, he was smiling because he knew exactly what was about to happen. 72 hours later, nobody spoke, because there was nothing left to say. The KKK was gone. The community was protected, and justice, in its own unofficial way, had been served. That smile said everything that needed to be said.